In this fictional tale, imagine a moment when political theater stops being performance and becomes something much more raw, much more human. Picture a congressional hearing in Washington, D.C., where the usual script of power and procedure is abruptly interrupted. Not by an American politician, but by a visiting African leader who refuses to stay silent. This is a story of courage, of dignity, and of solidarity that crosses continents. But what you're about to witness might just change how you think about where true leadership comes from. The morning sun spilled across the marble steps of the Capitol as the city stirred to life. Another day of carefully choreographed debates, flashbulbs, and power games. Inside the Oversight Committee chamber, the air was thick with anticipation. Something felt different. Reporters clutched their notebooks a little tighter. Staffers exchanged hushed updates. Even the veteran lawmakers shifted in their seats as if bracing for a storm. At exactly 10:47 a.m., Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett walked into the chamber. Her steps were slow, deliberate, like someone walking into a courtroom that had already reached its verdict. She wore a navy blazer that held its shape like armor. Her hair was perfectly styled, but her jaw was locked just a little too tight. Anyone paying attention could see. She wasn't just here to testify. She was here to defend something sacred. The chamber was a monument to American ideals, or at least to the image of them. Ornate ceilings, polished mahogany, oil portraits of dead men staring down from the walls. The flag stood still in the corner, as if waiting to see what kind of country it was representing today. Jasmine took her seat. Hands folded, eyes forward. Calm on the outside. Inside, a storm. The chairman, a silver-haired man with the tired scowl of someone used to being obeyed, struck his gavel once. The echo bounced off the marble like a warning shot. The committee will come to order. The first hour unfolded as expected. Republicans threw traps disguised as questions. Democrats tossed softballs, trying to let Jasmine speak. It was the same old dance, predictable, rehearsed, dull. But beneath the surface, pressure was building, like a fault line waiting to snap. It happened in the second hour. A congressman from Texas leaned forward, his face flushed with either indignation or caffeine. He spoke with the slow, performative sarcasm of someone who thought he was delivering a knockout line. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, "don't you think your remarks about systemic racism are a bit dramatic? I mean, it's 2025, not 1965. Jasmine didn't flinch. She had heard that line before. Too many times. The suggestion that history had ended, that pain had expired, that justice had already been delivered. She leaned in. Her voice was clear, steady, but burning just beneath the surface. "Congressman, with all due respect, when kids in my district are still being funneled out of classrooms, when hospitals still turn away families because of zip codes, when young black men are—" Bang. The chairman's gavel slammed down. "Your time is up, Congresswoman. You're out of order." The room fell silent. She blinked. Cut off mid-sentence. Not because she was inappropriate, not because she was inaccurate, but because her truth was inconvenient. She sat straighter. Her voice rose, not in panic, but in principle. "Then grant me just 60 seconds to respond to being labeled emotional for defending basic civil rights." There it was, the word they always used to shut her down. Emotional, not intelligent, not assertive, just emotional. A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Some lawmakers laughed softly, the kind of chuckle that says, "We've seen this before." Others looked away, unwilling to confront what was unfolding. Then the congressman from Texas spoke again, reclining in his chair with smug satisfaction. "Congresswoman," he said, "maybe what this chamber needs is a little less drama and a little more discipline. If you could just control your emotions." The words hit her like a slap. Control your emotions, as if passion was a liability, as if the centuries of injustice her community had endured were just a talking point to be delivered calmly, like a debate on trade tariffs. Something cracked inside her, not broken, but shifted, like the sound of ice under pressure. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a congresswoman. She was every black woman who had ever been told to sit down, be quiet, and act grateful. But this time, someone was listening. From the visitors' gallery, a figure stirred. A visiting African president who had remained silent through most of the hearing stood up slowly. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't need to. What he said next would not only shake the room, but ripple far beyond it. Because sometimes, the real voice of change doesn't come from the expected seat at the table. It rises from the margins and refuses to be silenced. But then, something extraordinary happened. For most in the chamber, the man seated in the diplomatic gallery barely registered. He was a guest, not a participant, a foreign dignitary from Burkina Faso, present as part of a routine diplomatic initiative to observe American democracy in action. Expected to smile, take notes, and perhaps exchange pleasantries in private. No one imagined he would speak. They were wrong. President Ibrahim Traoré had watched the proceedings with growing unease. At 35, he had seen enough of the world to recognize injustice in all its forms. Covert, bureaucratic, and dressed in suits. He had survived coups, stared down generals, and rebuilt broken systems brick by brick. But what he saw now wasn't just disrespect. It was something deeper, a coordinated silencing of truth. And that he could not ignore. He rose slowly. At first, it seemed like nothing. A visiting official stretching his legs, perhaps leaving early. But then he stepped past the others in the gallery. Past security, past protocol, past the invisible wall separating the watchers from the powerful. The air changed. A security guard stiffened, reaching for his radio. The chairman's eyes narrowed. Reporters twisted in their seats. Cameras swiveled like hunting dogs catching a scent. Yet Traoré walked calmly. No panic, no outburst, only purpose. When he reached the space just behind Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's chair, he stopped. He didn't tower, he didn't speak. He stood, present, unshaken. A silent declaration, she is not alone. The stillness that followed wasn't the hush of boredom or anticipation. It was sharp, electrified, alive, like the seconds before a storm breaks. Then he spoke. If the voice of a woman defending her dignity is called drama, he said, his accent soft but distinct, his English clear as glass, then this chamber is not fit for democracy. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every syllable landed like a stone in still water. Reporters froze mid-sentence. Lawmakers blinked. Even the most indifferent aides looked up from their glowing screens. Jasmine turned slowly, eyes wide, not just with surprise, but with recognition. Not of him, not yet, but of the truth he had spoken out loud. The truth no one else in the room had dared say. Troy's gaze swept the room, calm, steady, unapologetic. He wasn't impressed by power. He had seen worse. He had faced worse. Now he was reading them, each face, each reaction, as a commander reads a battlefield. In my country, he said, we are told justice is blind. But here, I see justice has ears that do not listen, and mouths that rush to silence. The chairman finally found his voice, or tried to. Mr. President, this is highly inappropriate, he stammered, fumbling for his gavel like a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. But Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't yield. He didn't apologize. Instead, he asked a single, devastating question. Is it inappropriate to speak when silence becomes complicity? The words sliced through the air like a blade. A low gasp echoed from the gallery. Reporters scrambled to keep up, their pens flying now. Every instinct told them they were witnessing history. But Traoré wasn't done. "This woman fights," he said. "She fights with words, with reason, with the truth too many pretend not to hear. She fights because people with her skin, her voice, are only listened to when they cry. And even then, barely." He was no longer just defending Jasmine. He was indicting the room, the institution, the ritual silencing disguised as procedure. He was holding up a mirror and making them look. Then he said it, not loudly, but with conviction that filled the room. "Today, I will not let her cry alone." And with that, he reached out, slowly, deliberately, and placed a hand on Jasmine's shoulder. It wasn't possessive. It wasn't for show. It was solidarity. It was power. It was human. The room didn't move. Couldn't. In that single gesture, all the artificial walls, nationality, protocol, race, power, crumbled. For the first time in a very long time, Jasmine felt something rare. Not applause, not politeness. She felt seen, heard, protected. And then, as if summoned by the current of that moment, memory surged. 3 years earlier, a dusty courtyard in Burkina Faso. She had come as part of a congressional delegation to promote girls' education. Most of it had been ceremony, photo ops, polite applause, staged meetings. But there was one moment she'd never forgotten. She had stood before a village gathering, speaking passionately about women's rights, when an elder interrupted. "Young woman," he said sternly, "in our culture, women do not speak on such matters. Leave this to the men." Her colleagues looked away, uncomfortable. A few local officials stepped forward to smooth things over. But Jasmine had stayed firm, calm, dignified, unmoved. She had finished her speech. And afterward, a young military officer had approached quietly. He had said only one thing. "You did not let them silence you. That takes courage." Then he had vanished into the crowd. She never saw him again. Until now. Standing behind her, no longer a young officer, but the president of Burkina Faso. No longer an observer, now a voice, now an ally, now a witness who refused to look away. The chamber was starting to shift again, the silence breaking, the old guard struggling to reassert control, anger, confusion, defiance, all rising. But something else had entered the room, something they couldn't dismiss. Dignity, and it had a voice. The chairman leaned in toward his aides, whispering urgently, scrambling for a response. There was no protocol for this. You couldn't exactly have a visiting head of state arrested, not without turning a moment of disruption into an international crisis. Still, the rules were crumbling in real time. From the dais, a Republican congresswoman from Georgia slammed her button and leaned into her microphone. "This is outrageous," she snapped, her voice trembling with fury. "We cannot allow foreign interference in our democratic process." Troy turned to her, calm and composed, his eyes steady. "Madam," he said evenly, "I am not interfering. I am participating. There is a difference." "You have no right to speak here," she barked. "This is America. We handle our own affairs." Troy didn't blink. "And yet," he replied, "your affairs shape the world. Your democracy is held up as a model. What happens in this room echoes across oceans. If that model is broken, should the world not notice?" Her words fell silent before they even hit the floor. Because he was right, and everyone in that room knew it. For decades, America had projected its democratic ideals outward, preaching justice, transparency, and the rule of law to the globe. But what happened when those same values collapsed inward? What happened when the beacon failed to shine on its own ground? A young Democratic congressman from California took the opportunity. "Perhaps," he said, his voice measured but bold, "we should listen to what our guest has to say. Isn't that what democracy is? Hearing all voices?" The suggestion set the room ablaze. Republicans erupted in protest, citing parliamentary rules. Democrats leaned forward, sensing the winds shifting. Cameras spun toward the center of the storm. Reporters typed furiously. Tweets flew. History was unfolding, raw and unscripted. And through it all, President Ibrahim Traoré stood still. He had spoken his truth. That was enough. Then, Jasmine rose. The room stilled. She stood slowly, deliberately, her presence filling the space as though she were twice her size. This time, her voice rang out not with defense, but with clarity. "Let the record show," she said, her words sharp and luminous, "that I was not alone today." It was more than acknowledgement. It was a declaration. A subtle rebuke of the very structure that had tried to silence her. It wasn't just about Troy. It was about all who'd ever spoken out and been ignored. All who'd stood up only to be shouted down. That simple sentence cracked the dam. Chaos followed. Republicans demanded Troy be escorted out. Democrats called for a recess. The chairman pounded his gavel again and again, desperate to bring the genie back into the bottle. But it was too late. The damage, if it could be called that, had already become transformation. The healing had begun. Because sometimes it takes a stranger to show you your reflection. And sometimes it takes an outsider to remind you what your values once meant. As the chamber broke into emergency recess, reporters swarmed Jasmine. Flashbulbs, microphones, questions overlapping like waves. Everyone wanted to know what she thought, how she felt, what this meant. But her eyes were on him. Troy was being escorted out, not arrested, but protected, shielded more for diplomatic optics than punishment. As he passed her table, their eyes met. She mouthed, "Thank you." He gave the smallest nod, a flicker of a smile touching his lips, and then he was gone, swept out in a blur of security personnel and political noise. But the moment, that moment, lived on. Within hours, clips of the exchange had exploded across social media. The hashtags #wasn't alone and #Troy stands up lit up timelines from New York to Nairobi. Commentary poured in from around the globe. The African Union praised Troy's principled stand for democratic integrity. The European Parliament passed a resolution calling for greater protection of women's voices in democratic institutions. The UN Secretary-General made a rare personal statement, urging nations to listen more carefully to those they so often silence. But it wasn't just leaders speaking. It was ordinary people. Women around the world sharing stories of being cut off, shut down, dismissed. Young activists stepping into their voices with new fire. Veterans of political fights saying simply, "We see you." The moment had become a symbol, not just of defiance, but of connection. A signal that justice knows no borders and dignity requires no passport. In the days that followed, political fallout rippled outward. The chairman faced mounting pressure to resign. Legal scholars questioned the committee's conduct. Civil society groups seized the incident as a rallying cry. Republican members involved in the silencing found themselves forced to answer questions they had long avoided. But the real shift wasn't procedural. It was moral. Something deeper had cracked open. The myth of equal voice, the illusion of fairness, the machinery of suppression exposed under fluorescent lights. It raised the question, who gets to speak, and who gets to be heard? 1 week later, as the uproar finally began to settle, Jasmine stood alone on the Capitol steps. Dusk had fallen. The marble columns above her glowed in fading light. The building stood as it always had, monolithic, immovable. But inside her, something had changed. She thought she was alone. Until Dash. "Congresswoman." She turned. Troy was walking toward her. No fanfare, no cameras. Just him, and his security detail lingering a respectful distance behind. He had returned for quiet meetings with the State Department, but clearly He had made time for this. "Mr. President," she said, offering her hand, "I never had the chance to thank you." He took it, his grip firm and warm. "There is no need," he replied. "Not between allies." They stood there for a moment, shoulder to shoulder, watching the final light slip behind the dome. The city behind them buzzed with business, policy, power, distractions, but here, on these old marble steps, there was stillness, and peace, and a promise, unspoken but understood, that solidarity has no borders, and justice begins with standing beside the silenced. "Why did you speak?" Jasmine asked quietly. They stood together beneath the Capitol's grand columns, their voices soft against the hum of distant traffic. "You could have stayed silent. No one expected anything from you. It would have been easier." Troy paused, thoughtful. "Because when injustice becomes normal," he said, "silence becomes betrayal. And I've spent my life refusing to betray my principles." She nodded slowly. "Well," she said, her voice steady now, "I'm glad you didn't stay silent." "Neither did you," he replied. "They just weren't ready to hear you." "But they're listening now," she said, a quiet fire behind her words. "The whole world is." He smiled. "Yes. And that makes all the difference." They began walking down the steps together side by side. For Jasmine, the weight she had carried for years in the corridors of power began to lift. Not completely, but enough to breathe. This wasn't the naive hope of someone new to the fight. This was the bruised, unyielding hope of a woman who had been knocked down more times than she could count, and stood back up every time. The events of the hearing had laid bare the machinery of power, how it could be used not just to govern, but to humiliate, to erase, to silence. And yet, it had also revealed something else. That even here in the most rigid halls of American authority, truth could still crack through the marble. That courage, when shared, could echo louder than a gavel. Their footsteps echoed across the Capitol steps, the city sprawling out ahead of them, flawed, messy, complicated, but full of possibility. As they reached the last step, Troy turned. "The work continues," he said simply. Jasmine met his gaze. "Yes," she agreed. "The work continues." They parted then, he toward the embassy, she toward her office. But they carried something with them, a quiet assurance that they weren't fighting alone, that somewhere across oceans and borders there were others just like them, fighting in their own chambers, in their own villages, in their own languages, for the same thing: dignity, truth, justice. The story of that day would spread. It would be dissected by journalists, quoted in speeches, taught in classrooms. There would be backlash, there would be praise, there would be spin. But the real legacy would be simpler. It would live in the ripple effect. The single mother in Detroit who had been shut down at a school board meeting. The young Latina attorney dismissed in a partners meeting. The elder black woman fighting for clean air in a forgotten neighborhood. All of them would hear Jasmine's voice and see Troy's stand and think, "Maybe I'm not alone either." The next morning, Jasmine's office was a storm of energy. Phone lines jammed, emails overflowing, press requests from everywhere, BBC, Al Jazeera, CNN, grassroots blogs. Her chief of staff, Maria, entered holding a thick stack of messages. "Congresswoman," she said breathlessly, "we've had over 3,000 calls since yesterday. The voicemail system crashed. Twice." Jasmine looked up from the prepared statement her comms team had drafted. An official-sounding response meant to calm Washington. She scanned it for a second, then shook her head. "Cancel the press conference." Maria blinked. "Ma'am?" "Cancel it. We're not doing politics as usual today." Across town, the embassy of Burkina Faso was under its own siege of attention. President Troy sat in a worn leather chair inside the ambassador's office. The walls were lined with dusty photographs from decades of diplomatic formality. Ambassador Alman Kabor paced nervously behind his desk. "Mr. President," Kabor said, his voice tight with stress, "the State Department has called twice this morning. They're concerned." Troy raised an eyebrow. "Concerned?" "They say this sets a dangerous precedent, that other foreign dignitaries may feel emboldened to intervene in American proceedings." Troy remained silent. "I told them you were speaking as a private observer, not in your official capacity. That's correct, isn't it, sir?" Troy leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Ambassador, when did standing up for justice become a diplomatic incident?" Kabor hesitated. "When it happened in the U.S. Congress," he said quietly. "Sir, these people have long memories. They control aid, trade deals, military training. One moment of moral clarity could cost us—" Troy cut him off. "Cost us what? Their respect? We never had it. Their money? It comes with strings that strangle us. Their friendship? It's only offered when we stay silent." Kabor fell quiet. He had heard that tone before, years ago during the revolution. The voice of a man who had chosen his battle and accepted the price. Finally, he asked, almost in a whisper, "What do you want me to tell them?" Troy stood, walking slowly to the window. Outside, the traffic of Washington moved on, unbothered, unaware. "Tell them I came to watch democracy," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "And I saw a woman being silenced. I did what any honest man should have done." Kabor nodded slowly. "And if they ask again?" Troy didn't look back. "Tell them I do it again." "Tell them," Troy said evenly, "that the president of Burkina Faso stands by his words. Tell them we judge our allies not by their power but by their principles, and if they have a problem with that, they're welcome to schedule a meeting." Back in her office, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was navigating a storm of her own. The political fault lines were becoming visible, clearer by the hour. Conservative pundits called for her censure, accusing her of undermining decorum. Progressive voices praised her as a symbol of defiance. Meanwhile, Democratic leadership grew increasingly anxious, fearful that the moment's momentum might derail their carefully negotiated legislative calendar. But the calls kept coming, hundreds of them. Each message, each voice, reminded Jasmine why she ran for office in the first place. Then came a voice she didn't expect. Young, unsure, but resolute. "Congresswoman Crockett?" "Yes, this is she. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm a first-year law student at Georgetown. I just wanted to thank you." Jasmine smiled. "Thank me for what, Sarah?" "For not backing down. For showing us it's possible to stand up for what's right, even when it feels like the whole world is trying to shut you down. I've been following your work for months. But yesterday, it gave me hope." Jasmine leaned back in her chair, moved. She felt the weight of that word, hope, heavy, earned. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" "Of course. What are you going to do with that hope?" The line was silent for a beat. Then Sarah answered, "I'm going to use it. Someday when I'm in court and someone tries to silence me or question why I'm even there, I'll remember that moment. I'll remember you. And I'll remember I'm not alone." After the call, Jasmine sat quietly, watching the Capitol dome framed in the gray October sky. Its symbolism was complicated, lofty ideals, tangled history. But she knew this. Change was possible, slow, messy, incomplete, but real. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Congresswoman, this is Ibrahim Troy. I hope you don't mind. I asked for your contact. I wanted to share something with you." She replied almost instantly. "Of course not, Mr. President. What did you want to share? The real reason I stood up yesterday. It's longer than what I could say on the Capitol steps. I'm listening, and are you free for coffee? There's a place that serves real West African coffee. I think it's time we talked about the future. Jasmine glanced at her calendar, stacked with votes, meetings, and policy briefings. But beside it sat a thick folder filled with messages from people who had found courage in her defiance. She smiled. I'll be there in an hour. The coffee shop was small, tucked into a quiet corner of Dupont Circle, the kind of place even political staffers didn't know existed. The owner, a Senegalese woman named Fatou, recognized them both instantly but offered only a respectful nod before seating them in a quiet corner. This is where I come to think, Troy said, hands wrapped around a ceramic mug. The aroma of spiced coffee lingered in the air. When the embassy feels too sterile, when the politics get too loud. I have a place like that too, Jasmine said. A diner back in my district. The owner still calls me that girl who used to argue with everyone in high school. They laughed. For a moment, the weight of headlines and political theater melted into the comfort of human connection. Then Jasmine leaned in. You said you wanted to tell me something. Troy nodded. It wasn't just about you, he began. Though your courage, what you endured in that hearing, that was part of it. He paused, searching for words. It was about my sister, Aminata. Jasmine's posture softened. She was 3 years older than me. Brilliant, unstoppable. She wanted to be a lawyer, fight for women's rights in our country. He looked down into his mug. She died in a car accident when I was 22. But before she died, she made me promise something. Jasmine listened. The silence between them was sacred. She said, if you ever have the power to speak for someone who's being silenced, do it, no matter the cost, no matter the consequences. He looked up, his eyes unwavering. Yesterday, when they tried to shut you down, I felt her, like she was standing behind me, her voice in my ear, her hand on my shoulder. Jasmine reached across the table, her voice low. She would be proud of you. I hope so, Troy said. But more than that, I hope she'd be proud of what comes next. What comes next? She asked. Troy leaned forward, his tone shifting from memory to momentum. That's why I reached out. This moment, it's bigger than you or me. What happened in that chamber, that wasn't just a protest. It was a signal. People around the world, especially women, they saw it, and they're responding. I've been getting the same messages, Jasmine said, from everywhere. Argentina, South Africa, Bangladesh. People who've been silenced, suddenly speaking. Exactly, Troy said, pulling out his phone. Look. He scrolled through messages. A human rights lawyer in Kenya. She wants to start a mentorship program for young girls. A teacher in Brazil organizing local forums about democratic participation. A student in India planning a conference on women's political leadership. Jasmine scrolled through the messages, wide-eyed. This is a movement, she said quietly. It could be, Troy replied, if we help shape it. She looked up. What are you proposing? An alliance, he said. Not governments, not institutions, people, leaders, women, young voices, a global coalition for dignity and democracy, rooted in the idea that justice doesn't need permission to cross borders. Jasmine leaned back, nodding slowly. The idea was audacious, complicated, risky, but it felt right. For the first time in a long time, she felt the future shift, just slightly, toward possibility.
Let's build it, she said. Troy raised his mug. To Aminata. Jasmine raised hers. To those who refused to be silent. They drank, and somewhere between the aroma of West African coffee and the hum of a city still waking up to what had happened, something new began. Not just a movement, but a memory in the making. The next chapter had arrived, and this time they would write it together. "This is incredible," Jasmine said, eyes wide. "And this is just the beginning." Troy nodded, the spark of vision already burning behind his calm demeanor. "What if we could take this energy, this moment, and turn it into something that lasts? Something that ensures voices like yours are never silenced again." "You're thinking global," Jasmine said, the idea dawning even as she spoke it aloud. "Something that crosses borders." "I'm thinking justice doesn't stop at borders," Troy replied. "I'm talking about something that recognizes democracy not as a national brand, but a shared responsibility. When it's threatened anywhere, it's threatened everywhere." Jasmine's heart quickened. This was bigger than legislation, bigger than party lines or committee rooms. This wasn't about policy. This was about power. Who gets it, who keeps it, and who gets left unheard? "What would it even look like?" she asked quietly. "I don't know yet," Troy admitted, "but I know where it starts. It starts with people like us, refusing to be silent, refusing to be divided. It starts with building bridges between movements, between countries, between anyone who believes everyone deserves to be heard." They stayed for 2 hours, talking, sketching ideas on napkins, recalling moments they had been silenced, and the people who helped them find their voice again. By the time they stepped out into the crisp evening air, something had begun. Not a plan, not a campaign, a movement. In the weeks that followed, it took shape. They called it the Global Justice Initiative, a network of advocates, activists, and public leaders committed to amplifying marginalized voices in democracies around the world. And to their surprise, the world responded. Within a month, grassroots chapters were forming in over 30 countries. From Nairobi to Manila, from Sao Paulo to Budapest, young people in particular gravitated to the idea that democracy wasn't a spectator sport. It was something they could shape with their voices, their hands, and their courage. But not everyone cheered. Conservative pundits in the U.S. blasted Jasmine for outsourcing democracy. Diplomats warned Troy that his activism could complicate trade deals. Even some centrist Democrats whispered concerns that the international push might distract from domestic priorities. Foreign policy elites rolled their eyes. "Grassroots activism can't solve geopolitical crises," they muttered in op-eds. But the first test proved them wrong. When a prominent women's rights activist in Hungary was arrested for leading peaceful demonstrations against repressive new laws, the Global Justice Initiative moved swiftly. Coordinated protests erupted outside Hungarian embassies across 5 continents. A social media campaign reached millions. Allies and member governments applied diplomatic pressure behind the scenes. Within a week, the activist was released. Within 2, Hungary announced a review of the controversial laws. "This is what's possible," Troy said during a video call with Jasmine and the initiative's steering team. "When we reject silence, when we refuse to believe injustice is inevitable, we make space for change." But with visibility came vulnerability. Authoritarian regimes labeled them dangerous. Cyber attacks tried to shut them down. Fake news campaigns spread lies about their leaders, and some members were threatened, harassed, even detained. One week, 3 initiative members were arrested in different countries within 48 hours. Late that night, Jasmine called Troy. "Maybe we're going too fast," she said, exhaustion in her voice. "Maybe we're pushing too hard." "Do you remember how you felt that day in the hearing room?" Troy asked. "Like I was disappearing," she said. "Like I didn't matter." "And how did you feel when I stood up?" She exhaled. "Like I wasn't alone. Like I was finally seen." "That's what we're doing for people around the world," he said softly. We're showing them they're not invisible. Can we really stop now? Jasmine didn't answer right away, but in her heart, she already knew the answer. 6 months later, Jasmine stood at the podium of the United Nations General Assembly. The marble hall rose around her, soaring, imposing, historic. She had been invited to address the global body about the Global Justice Initiative, its growth, its mission, its vision, a movement now active in over 70 countries, with thousands of volunteers, dozens of elected allies, and a growing chorus of voices demanding to be heard. As she looked out over the assembled delegates, diplomats, presidents, ministers, her mind drifted back to a hearing room in Washington, to a gavel falling too soon, to a moment when her voice was silenced, and a stranger stood beside her. She thought of the young girl she used to be, the one who was told to speak more softly, to not raise her hand so much, to not make it about race. And now she stood here, before the world, speaking for those who still couldn't. For too long, she began, democracy has been treated like a finished product, packaged, polished, exported. But real democracy is messy, it's incomplete, it's noisy, and it only works when everyone's voice is counted, not just the loudest, not just the wealthiest, not just the safest. We started the Global Justice Initiative to remind people that they're not alone, that dignity has no borders, that silence is never neutral, and that justice, true justice, requires courage, not comfort. Applause rippled across the hall. Some delegates clapped politely, some nodded solemnly, but a few stood. Among them, in the gallery, was Ibrahim Troy. Their eyes met. A quiet exchange. The work continued. 6 months ago, Jasmine began, her voice steady, echoing through the grand chamber of the United Nations. I was silenced in a congressional hearing for daring to speak about injustice. A hush fell over the room. It wasn't the first time, and I knew it wouldn't be the last. But on that day, something unexpected happened, something extraordinary. She paused, eyes scanning the diplomatic gallery. There he was, President Ibrahim Troy, seated with quiet dignity, his gaze fixed on hers. The same calm intensity from that day had not faded. A visitor from Burkina Faso stood up and reminded the world of something we too often forget. Democracy is not a spectator sport. Soft murmurs of recognition moved through the crowd. Cameras clicked. Pens froze midair. That moment taught me something profound, she continued. Democracy isn't just about our nations, our laws, our institutions. It's about all of us. When any voice is silenced, all voices are weakened. When one person is dismissed for telling the truth, the foundation of justice everywhere trembles. Applause broke out, sustained, genuine, echoing across the chamber like a rising tide. But it wasn't just the sound that struck her. It was the look on their faces. Delegates from every continent weren't just applauding her speech, they were seeing themselves in it. This is bigger than me, Jasmine said, bigger than any hearing room or national boundary. The Global Justice Initiative has shown what becomes possible when we choose not to look away, when we reach across oceans and ideologies and say, we will not let each other stand alone. She paused. Let it breathe. Because justice may begin in one place, but it never ends there, and silence anywhere is permission for injustice everywhere. After the speech, diplomats approached her from all directions. Some offered partnerships. Others asked how to bring the initiative to their countries. The energy was electric, not unlike that moment on the Capitol steps, when something impossible had begun to take root. Jasmine knew the road ahead would not be smooth. There would be setbacks, critics, moments of doubt. But she also knew this. Somewhere in the world, someone was standing up. Somewhere, someone was raising their voice. Somewhere, someone remembered they were not alone. And that changed everything. What had begun as a moment of interruption had become a movement, a global symbol of courage, a story that crossed borders and broke silences. And maybe most importantly, it had become a bridge, a link between strangers who might never meet, but who shared the same belief that dignity is universal, that democracy is human, not just institutional, that justice should not depend on geography. In the end, that's what democracy must be. Not just rules and routines, but the courage to question them. Not just institutions, but the people who make them matter. Yes, the congressional chamber would return to its normal rhythms. Yes, the political machine would grind on. But something fundamental had shifted.
A line had been crossed. A voice had been heard. A stand had been taken. And in that shared defiance between two people from different worlds, the true promise of democracy had flickered into life. Not perfectly, not fully, but genuinely. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. The future loomed ahead, full of unknowns. But for the first time in years, Jasmine wasn't afraid, because she wasn't facing it alone. She was part of something larger, something living, a movement built not on power but on courage, not on comfort but on truth, and not on one voice but on millions rising. And that, she realized, was the real victory. Not the moment someone stood up, but the lifetime of standing together that followed. The work continued, but this time, it continued with hope. And hope, she had learned, was the most powerful force in the world.